this time the progression actually confirms the key that we had arrived at, so which is F in this case. So we get there, and then there's some scalar motion in the viola, and then we seem to get to that chord of E flat in first inversion. And this feels like home key. This is a new key. How did we get to E flat as a key? The chord before it, so the chord of F in E flat would be 2. 2 is a subdominant. What you want after 2 is a dominant before going to 1. So what we're missing here really is the D. So that D that should have been there before we moved on. But that D is later. It's just, once again, Mozart is just delaying things. But it is there. So like there's, with that D a little delayed, we do have a full progression of 2 going to 5 and then resolving. So now we're in E flat. More scalar motion, we get to this chord, which is again F, and that moves to the chord of D. So D, after all this scalar motion in the first violin, this would go to E flat, and in fact it does. That's E flat. The only thing is that the second violin, we would have expected that to go to E flat. But once again, it's delaying its resolution, but also changing it. So if you count this B as being delayed and being part of a chord before, just as we did before with the D, then what we have here is this chord going to C. And I think that's what it is. So we had a progression in E flat that was 2 with a hidden 5 going to 1. Now we have the same thing in C. A 2, that's a chord of D, with a hidden 5 that includes that B, delayed B, going to C. Look at this dissonance. That's a dead giveaway that in fact we are in C. That dissonance is the first and the second notes in the scale, C and D. And that is part of a chord of 2 that calls for a dominant and helps establish the key. Yeah, I'm happy to say this is in C now, and we're expecting a dominant. So what actually happens? There it is. So the second violin and the cello complete that chord of dominant. And then they both do a chromatic scale on it, but it's just a chord of dominant. And then once that dominant resolves there, more scalar motion. Okay, so what's happening there? So the scales created this chord, which goes then to that chord where I think the G, as I just did, is just a delayed resolution of the F. So it's really this chord going to this chord. It's kind of, again, the same thing that we saw in E flat and C. This chord is a chord of G, and we're going to a chord of F. That's 2 and 1. Is the 5 hidden somewhere? What we're missing is the E natural. And there's an E natural that I think serves the purpose at the beginning of that measure in the first violin. If you take that E natural into the chord, then this is a dominant of F. And then that's going to resolve here with the suspension in the second violin. And then chromatic scalar motion. And at some point that meant that the viola went to that F sharp. In the meantime, the cello had lowered the A into an A flat. So what was originally this, that would have led to G, went through a couple of chromatic passing tones and eventually landed on G. This is the augmented sixth chord, French chord, with D and F. But the key is that it has the F sharp and the A flat, both wanting to resolve outward onto the dominant. So if we take that progression from this 5, it went to a 1 that becomes an emphasis to 4, that 4 became the French chord, and we land in the dominant. The remainder of the passage of the page, the whole opening, is just a prolongation of that chord of G as dominant. So there's this progression, which is 5-1 and 7-5, and that happens several times in different dispositions. Always going back to the chord of G, and eventually you reach the chord here, and on it you have a couple of chromatic neighbors. Always going back to the notes of the chord until you have that, and the introduction is done. I think that's it for this one. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.